these three organizations have come together to address perhaps one of the most critical questions on the minds of Africans. We've taken the bull by the horns by trying to bring three very broad and themselves problematic issues together and to see whether there is a possibility of addressing these issues comprehensively. So we're looking at and asking ourselves whether there can be a linkage between energy access, between climate change adaptation, and just transition on the continent. And there's a reason for that. Number one, the energy conversation tends to focus on emission reductions. But the reality on the African continent is that there's a big problem of energy poverty. But we also know that energy poverty is a driver of climate vulnerabilities. And if we have to transition justly, we must address the question of energy poverty as well as help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so this afternoon we have a panel that is going to be interrogating these issues and try to help us understand the best ways in which we can make these connections, but also how we can address the complexities that we create by making these connections. We were supposed to start with some remarks by the different partners who have come together, but we will keep that for the end. And I'd like to invite our moderator for the day to take up from here and lead us through the panel conversation. We will also leave room for some questions at the end. So thank you so much for honoring our invitation, and I hope that this is going to be a very fruitful conversation and also informative because we are actually charting new terrain here. So thank you so much. Yabri, I want to leave the panel with you and sit down with the audience.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Hi, everyone. My name is Jabri Ibrahim. I'm from Kenya, and I'm in the Africa team of the 2 UN Climate Change High-Level Champions, and we focus on non-state actor engagement. This is basically everyone that is not a national government, minister or head of state. So everyone in the room, I think, if you're representing civil society, indigenous people, gender, youth, I would really welcome you to be part of this discussion. And I feel very privileged to be moderating this panel because it represents different regions, but also different sectors. On my left, we have Rebecca Shirley from the World Resources Institute, the Africa Deputy Director. And then we have on my far left, Augustus Jamshi from the Africa Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access. And on my right, we have Leonie Bukamp from Germanwatch. And I would love to ask each of you a few questions to get your perspectives on the nexus between access, justice, and this kind of how Africa can address this increasingly systemic issue. Maybe just for full disclosure, madam, do you mind introducing yourself if you don't mind? Do you mind introducing yourself?
Ok. Bonsoir à tous. Je suis donc Fatoumata Diallo. I will speak in French, right? Ok. Je suis donc Fatoumata Diallo. Je suis la présidente à l'Association écologique pour le développement durable et notre organisation est membre de l'Alliance panafricaine pour la justice climatique et de ACSEA. Merci.
Merci, thank you for that. So I just, before I go to my panel, I just want to make a few remarks on the situational analysis of the energy sector. And please keep in mind, we're discussing the Africa energy sectors and the special needs that exist within this sector. And the world and the development finance talks a big game about the renewable energy potential that exists in Africa. 60% of the world's solar resources is in Africa, that Africa's wind potential could power the world is 150 times over, but that does not translate to the financing that reaches Africa. If Africa has 60% of the world's solar, then it should get 60% of the world's investment in solar. But this is not seen because there's a lot of challenges, there's perceived risks, there's credit rating agencies that do not understand Africa, that rate Africa, and there's a bit pushback from African nations on how this affects the cost of capital in Africa. So it's 2 to 3 times more expensive to do wind and solar in Africa than it is in China. And Africa has more wind and solar technical potential than these other regions. And I also want to discuss one other issue is the private sector is too risk averse in investing in Africa. But on the public sector side of it, development funders are declining to support fossil fuel projects abroad and instead prioritizing clean energy solutions. That's the state of play. And of course, clean energy investment is critical, but the refusal to fund any sort of alternatives hampers Africans' autonomy, sovereignty to make decisions that would affect clean cooking access, energy access, last mile access, etc. And it prevents Africa from kind of addressing their issues with fitting their unique economic, social, ecological circumstances, because Africa is not a monolith. African countries are completely different. And for example, in Kenya, it's very easy to kind of have a really green electricity grid because we have a lot of geothermal potential, but that's not the case, for example, Nigeria. So I just wanted to point that out. And maybe to close, I want to just make 3 points. There's a big call on tripling renewables and doubling efficiency, which is essential, but I just want to make 3 kind of safeguards I think should be embedded if we are to meet tripling renewables in Africa. First, I think development finances should maintain a broad criteria for energy infrastructure that goes just beyond emission reductions and include national development aims for Africa, such as poverty reduction, job creation, industrialization, clean cooking. And number 2, that development threshold should be African nations below the agreed development threshold should be granted exemptions from the strictest climate policies, e.g. no trade policies if the country has not met a certain threshold of development. And then the third one, my final point before I pass to my panel, is I think any disinvestment from fossil fuel projects should be rechanneled into support for the clean energy sector investment. So for example, if China makes a disinvestment pledge for fossil fuel abroad, those billions should be reinvested into wind, solar, geothermal. It should not just be a net loss of the investment in the energy sector in Africa. So I'll stop there, and maybe I start with you, Rebecca, because we speak a lot about the state of play in Africa, and also there's a lot of entrenched biases, there's a lot of challenges within the sector. But in your point of view, and as an expert in this sector, what is some of the biggest challenges that Africa does face in ensuring universal access to electricity, to also clean cooking, any form of energy, while at the same time ensuring we are kind of Paris aligned? So how do we balance these 2 realities in the African continent?
Yeah. Jabri, I'm going to answer that question by sort of picking up where you started on, or where Eugene started on the linkages between access, adaptation, and transition, just transition. And the question in my mind is almost, how could they not be linked? Mm-hmm. Access, adaptation, and just transition. If you think about the latest IPCC annual reports and what they say about Africa, the confidences in the impacts is only going up. So this latest report says at 1.5 degree Celsius change, there's a moderate confidence that yield decline is going to happen. But anything above 1.5, the confidence is high. Anything above 1.5, which is unfortunately, where we are headed today, means that the confidence in yield reductions is high, is very, very likely. That's what the latest reports are saying. So what does that mean for us in a continent where our populations are growing? 1 in every 4 people on the face of this planet will be born in Africa or of African descent by 2040. It means that food sovereignty and food security become absolutely crucial. How do you deliver food sovereignty whilst your yields are crashing and burning? We're talking about irrigation. We're talking about other on-farm inputs like fertilizer. Therefore, we're talking about energy access. We're also talking about localizing value addition and processing of foods, which is also about off-farm energy access. Not only that, that's at the national level when we think about sort of what we need to be building adaptive capacity. At the locally led adaptation level, if you think about that's sort of the national level, right? What do individual communities need to be doing to advance their preparedness for this climate future that is already in our face? We're talking about water, and we're talking about energy. Why are we also talking about energy? Water is sort of we talk about energy as the golden thread, but honestly it's water, right? That is this golden thread. Communities are going to have to make sure that we have readily available access to water. This means we're talking about watershed restoration, we're talking about watershed rehabilitation, and all of that means less standing trees for fuel wood. So it means that we're talking about alternatives for cooking. So whether we're talking about how we nationally prepare and resilience ourselves, fortify ourselves, or we're talking at the level of the community, we are talking about energy access. And if that access is not affordable, if it's not highly reliable, high quality access, then we're jeopardizing the very ability of communities and our national economies to adapt to what we know is a high confidence future. So in my mind, the justice element, the access element, and the adaptation element are inextricably linked. And your question, Jabri, is, well, what are the challenges? And you were referencing the statistics. We've got all of the energy potential that any continent could want. We have more than any continent could want, 17 times what the entire rest of the world will need in 2050 when we are an entirely electrified economy. 17 times more power than the world will need is sitting here in Africa. So, and your question is, well, if we've got all of that need and we've got all of that resource, then what's the challenge in the middle? Why doesn't the capital sort of flow here naturally? Why aren't projects being developed naturally? And there are many challenges there. And in particular, we're talking about access to finance. Of course, we've all heard that mantra, that refrain. But when you unpack what we really mean by access to finance, there's a lot that underpins that. We're talking about local currency, access to finance in local currencies. We're talking about access to finance at interest rates that are affordable, that are realistic for local developers. We're talking about project development, technical assistance support. We're talking about the laying of the foundation of ancillary services, transmission, distribution, etc. All of these are sort of the enabling factors that go into the when we talk about access to finance, that's all what's comprised there. And we have a lot to do on each of those fronts to enable the access to the finance, to develop the energy that will give us the ability to adapt to the changing climate. So to me, those are all very connected. And I see, and in fact, if there's anyone here from the Power Up campaign? Anyone familiar with that? There's an entire campaign, yes, Eugene, probably a part of, that is built around making this connection and building champions for energy access, from energy access and the locally led adaptation movement, bringing those champions together for this cause.
It's, I completely agree. It's kind of the same story. And just maybe to agree on your 3 points, investment needs to come in local currency with affordable premiums and long-term in nature. And it's kind of a whole of society approach when we look at this adaptation and mitigation. But we also have a stake in meeting Paris because of food sovereignty, as you mentioned,
Exactly.
water security. Africa will stand to lose if we pierce that threshold of 1.5.
100%, yes.
So it's kind of, as always, a nuanced,
Yes.
complicated discussion.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth, you've just joined us.
Yes,
So
thank
maybe
you.
I can introduce you to the audience. So Elizabeth Chege, Energy Efficiency and Cooling Specialist at the SE for All, Sustainable Energy for All. But maybe before you, I'll give you a moment to settle. I can ask Augustine a question on also how you view us reaching the last mile access, and how does this help kind of communities in the adaptation goal? How is access kind of also an adaptation win for climate change? How do you see this happening?
Thank you very much, and I'd like to appreciate the fact that we're working together on this very sensitive and yet important topic. Like Eugene said before sitting down there, you know, the way renewable energy has been sold in this space has been for mitigation purposes. And these conversations like what we're having here can change the rhetoric. It is not just about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but it's more energy that is easily accessible for the communities at the last mile. So that said, we believe that the challenges that these local communities face in having access to energy, any form of energy, by the way, so for now, stems from the fact that energy was sold to the continent as a commodity. Being a commodity, it is like it's just those who can afford that can have access to it. So the policy of having a universal access to energy as a policy and as a right to the communities has never been part of the African policy or politics. Unless and until we get to that point where we know that access to energy is a human right, right of the population, we will still be, running around. And that brings in the issue of the private sector looking more at the risks of investing in local communities because they may not have the money to pay back for their investments and make gains. This makes it much more complicated to the communities because you cannot adapt to climate change without having access to affordable and efficient energy. That makes the poverty situation even double. The more you are poor, you cannot afford access to energy, then you remain poorer and poorer, which means you may never have access to energy. So why is ACSEA campaigning for access to renewable energy? Our campaign is based on the fact that when we are talking about renewable energy, it is not just about energy from renewable sources. It is the governance around the whole system, making sure that energy, politics, and policies are those that encourage people-centeredness, rights, and participation, effective participation of the people at the last mile. With that in mind, we think renewable energy should be that which makes sure that the people that need it most have also a say in how it is generated and distributed. I had the opportunity to talk to a former president from one of the poorest African countries. That was about 6 years ago when we were talking about sustainable or renewable energy. He said, Augustine, I was so infatuated about this issue of renewable energy. I invited some Chinese investors into my country. I started in my region, I'm quoting him. I started in my region, they installed solar panels. Then after a few months or a few years, everything was down. So now, my community thinks that renewable energy is energy for the poor people. So that perception has already shut off people from thinking about renewable energy because they think that it is just for the poor people because it breaks any time. We have to change this. We romanticize the fact that Africa is blessed with renewable energy potential. We in ACSEA don't see it that way. The person that commands it is the person that has the technology. How is Africa investing in technology to transform this potential into actual products, which is the energy itself? If technology to transform the wind, the sun, the water, and the whatever still comes from the north, built by the north, controlled by the north, then Africa will remain in darkness. So when we look at this systemic underlying circumstances, we have to start addressing them in order to make sure that the last person in the last mile has access to efficient, affordable energy for adaptation and resilience building.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much. I think you make very many important points, and I just want to encourage the audience to think about what you might want to ask this panel. We'll have a big 25-minute Q&A session, so just keep that in mind when you hear these reflections. And Augustine, I think what you say really triggers some thinking for me, because you said energy is sold as a commodity in African nations and not seen as a right, because they're not embedding justice, equity, and every person should have access to some form of energy, or they're trapped in this vicious cycle of poverty. And it also, there's a parallel in how green hydrogen was sold to Africa as an export commodity.
Exactly.
To decarbonize Europe. And you almost can't blame national governments, because every national government wants to export into the European market, the premiums. But I think what we should really question is how these commodities, could be green hydrogen, could be minerals, could be anything. What we should really question is how these resources, whatever it is from African nations, how do we go up the value chain? How do they benefit governments, communities? And then who owns these companies that operate within our borders? And is it equitable shareholding as well? So there's really a lot, there's such a rich discussion. There's a lot to kind of dissect. So I hope we'll go into a really comprehensive back and forth with the audience. I think that would be really interesting. But maybe let me go to my right side, to you, Lonnie. I think for you and your organization, Germanwatch, it would be good to hear how you see the different actors in this ecosystem, policymakers, experts, civil society, the private sector, cooperation. How do they work together to address the benefits, the challenges that we've talked about in the three things we're discussing here: energy access, just energy transition, adaptation. How can they all work together to address these issues?
Yeah, thank you, Jabri, and thank you also for getting the opportunity to speak to this very crucial topic. And it's a very rich question, I would say, so I'll try to keep it in a certain time frame and focus on the first part of the question. So how can a fruitful collaboration between these very different actors, policymakers, private sector, civil society, research, etc., actually be set up successfully? And this actually reminds me pretty much of the principle of a multi-actors partnership, which Germanwatch has gathered quite some experience during the last few years. And the multi-actors partnership actually is pretty much what you just described in the question. And there's, I think, no doubt that from a collaboration from these very different actors can come great value, as all actors have their very own perspectives. So research is, of course, doing crucial work, but sometimes is missing some practical aspects, or the private sector is regularly focusing very much on economic aspects, but sometimes is missing ecological or social aspects, which research and civil society, for example, can fill in. So what are actually the crucial prerequisites for the success of such a multi-actors partnership? First of all, there's a need for a common goal to get these actors all together to collaborate. then the development of a joint vision, a strategy, or also like a joint decision-making process can develop ownership and a feeling of responsibility within all the actors in such a partnership. And then building of trust and respect for one another requires close, transparent, and regular communication through different channels between the partners, not to lose touch and to follow up on each other's perspectives and positions to really understand each other and learn about each other's positions. However, you need to be aware that for the success of such a collaboration, creating an inclusive space of cooperation on eye level is basically as much of an effort as working towards the goal of the partnership itself. So you really have to want it. It always also depends on the context, to what extent this comprehensive process is possible. But keeping the ideal process in mind and trying to get as close to it as possible is the best way to realize such a successful collaboration between actors that are working in such different sectors, I would say.
Thank you so much. I think accountability is so key, and I have had some people call it or want accountability to come with some teeth. So accountability to what? And if you are accountable, then, and if you are not compliant with ESG or any sustainability regulation, then does it lead to some sort of, you know, there's the carrot, but then there's the stick. Is there a way to hold these corporations accountable? And then also, I often think, to what extent do corporations want to work with civil society? And I think Eugene can reflect a lot on how challenging it is to work, especially the biggest corporations on earth that often are the biggest emitters on this issue. So it's I think in an ideal scenario, civil society would be really empowered, and they'd be listened to, and they would come in from a really informed point of view. And I think it's so essential to continue funding civil society work, because it is the key. It is how we hold our corporations accountable, and I'm very convinced that that's part of the keeping 1.5 alive, Paris alive. Yeah, so maybe we can go to a francophone speaker. I do apologize. I'm not able to translate this question into French. Maybe I would be able to translate it into Swahili, but I'm not fluent in French. But maybe, Fatimatu, I can ask you, what are some of the best practices or successful initiatives that can be scaled up, replicated, to promote the three kind of pillars: access, transition, and energy adaptation within our continent? How do you see this happening?
Ok, merci beaucoup pour la parole. Je vais remercier l'organisation pour cette opportunité qui nous est donnée d'échanger sur ces questions-là qui tiennent énormément aux questions d'industrialisation de l'Afrique et surtout partager les questions de bonnes pratiques et les initiatives réussies surtout pour la mise en échelle. Alors, je vais partir sur les bonnes pratiques et les initiatives réussies que notre organisation a mises en place, mais également pour des organisations partenaires qui ont déjà été réalisées. Il faut dire que nous sommes une organisation qui travaille sur les questions de la transition juste, donc nous travaillons sur un site de collecte et de valorisation de déchets intégrés. Donc nous faisons la collecte des déchets et ensuite nous faisons le tri sélectif et nous procédons à la valorisation de ces différents déchets-là. Et donc, nous notons que par semaine, nous pouvons recevoir près de 1000 tonnes de déchets et dont près de 500 tonnes est valorisée à travers la transformation du charbon bio par la biomasse, les engrais, les biofertilisants les pavés plastiques et très bientôt les alvéoles d'œufs que nous produisions à travers les cartons recyclés que nous recevons. Alors, il faut dire qu'en matière de bonnes pratiques pour garantir un accès équitable aux énergies renouvelables, nous remarquons que dans de nombreuses régions en Afrique et particulièrement au Burkina Faso, des initiatives novatrices ont démontré que l'accès aux énergies renouvelables peut être étendu de manière significative par leurs impacts positifs, quantifiables surtout, tant sur l'environnement que sur la communauté. Nous avons des programmes axés sur les micro-réseaux solaires qui facilitent l'accès à l'énergie, surtout à l'énergie propre, mais également contribuant à rehausser les revenus. Alors, c'est d'implanter ces mini-réseaux-là dans des zones les plus reculées surtout, mais aussi impliquer ces communautés-là à la bonne compréhension de la bonne marche de ces mini-réseaux, mais cela contribue également à rehausser les activités qu'ils mènent et leur permet de générer des activités génératrices de revenus. Donc, on peut parler de l'électrification hors réseau, mais surtout de la collaboration publique-privée ont montré des résultats prometteurs par rapport à cela. Par exemple, avec une organisation en partenariat, nous avons mis en place un modèle de mini-réseau solaire à base de fours, à base de l'énergie thermique canalisée à travers des foyers améliorés en utilisant des combustibles propres comme du charbon bio qui permet l'électrification des ménages en milieu local. Donc, c'est utiliser ces foyers améliorés-là à travers les charbons bio que nous fabriquons par la biomasse, la récolte des déchets biomasse que nous récoltons, que nous transformons. Et ensuite, nous canalisons cette énergie thermique-là dans une sorte de batterie qui ensuite les permet d'avoir de l'électrification, des petites lampes ou même de recharger leur appareil. Sur les questions de la transition énergétique, comme initiative réussie pour une transition énergétique juste, déjà parler de la transition énergétique juste sans intégrer l'inclusion sociale, la création d'emplois verts et la formation de nos communautés locales pourrait être déjà vouée à l'échec. Et c'est ainsi donc, à travers toutes les initiatives vertes réalisées par notre organisation, la formation reste incontournable. Alors, nous comptons au jour d'aujourd'hui plus de 2000 personnes sensibilisées parce que vu que nous procédons à la collecte des déchets, nous mettons à la disponibilité des ménages des modèles de poubelles à tri sélective. Et avant même l'installation de ces poubelles-là, nous passons à la sensibilisation, mais également à la formation des jeunes et des femmes de la communauté pour leur faire comprendre le bienfait de notre processus. Alors, à travers nos volontaires, bien sûr, quand nous procédons également à la sensibilisation des maraîchers, à la sensibilisation également au niveau scolaire. En parlant d'adaptation au changement climatique, selon notre expérience d'adaptation, il faut plus parler, la question d'adaptation est beaucoup plus stratégique si nous souhaitons vraiment parler d'efficacité pour une adaptation résiliente. L'adaptation au changement climatique nécessite des approches flexibles et résilientes en fonction de notre position géographique. Il faut dire qu'il y a des efforts tels que la mise en place d'alertes précoces lorsqu'on observe des variations météorologiques et de l'utilisation des engrais bio que nous produisons également pour le développement de l'agriculture durable. Et aussi, il faut la construction de structures résistantes aux intempéries contre les résultats, pour démontrer des résultats beaucoup plus significatifs. Ces succès peuvent être reproduits et adaptés pour répondre aux besoins spécifiques des différentes régions. À cela, on ajoute également les cartons que nous recevons, que nous voudrions mettre à l'échelle pour une production, mais également pour la création d'emplois verts dans notre communauté. Et aussi, enfin, réduire l'émission des déchets au niveau de notre communauté. En quelque sorte, j'ai cité des initiatives que nous réalisons concrètement sur place, mais également des initiatives qui sont mises en place par des partenaires, comme je le disais, et tout de suite, que nous pouvons mettre à l'échelle, qui va créer de l'emploi à la jeunesse africaine. Merci beaucoup.
Maxi, thank you so much, Fatima. I think I captured a significant majority of that, but Eugene, I would request if you, when you do your closing, maybe you can translate some of that for Anglophone speakers in the audience. But I do appreciate the diversity, the linguistic diversity in the panel. Elizabeth, before we go to you, your question, I did want to tell my panel, I'll pass the microphone after Elizabeth's response to give kind of closing remarks, because I think we're also privileged to have all of you experts giving us all this critical information. And I want to give all of you kind of any opportunity to make any closing remarks before we go to the Q&A. Elizabeth, I think for you and ACSEA for all, heavily working especially with African nations, and I just want to ask, how do you ensure that the transition to low carbon energy systems is inclusive, equitable, just all this, but also how do you ensure that they reflect the needs, preferences, the nuances of countries? And I ask this kind of within the context of the energy transition investment plans that you've been launching with countries. So how do you kind of envision, other than like an Africa plan, like going to the country level, how is this, what's behind the scenes of this strategy? Why do we do this? Thank you.
Thank you for having me here, and apologies to my esteemed panelists and yourself for getting lost again. I had found the building before, something changed.
It's a
I
big
got
venue,
lost.
yeah.
Yes. So it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the question. I think a lot of the elements we are talking about, it's not an inclusive just energy transition if it doesn't consider the people on the ground. And there's all the goals and commitments that have been set in various COPs as well. We have the NDCs in countries. They're very, very aligned to the people's needs as much as possible, and also to the trajectory of what we need to do by 2050, for example. If I look at Kenya, there's the enhanced NDC. Then below that, there's adaptation and mitigation plans and even resilience plans that are being developed, which last 4 to 5 years, then they're updated. So they're not static documents that also involve the people from the ground. It involves our local people. But then when you look at that, you start questioning, where's the investment plan for that? Where's the money coming from? And a lot of these commitments you'll find have this clause of subject to a certain amount of money and investment coming in. But one of the things that we realize is the opportunity to now focus on the energy sector with SDG 7, which drives the other SDGs. We saw that if we don't really consider energy as a driving factor forward towards the transition, then we're missing the key point and we'll always be chasing our tails. So the energy transition and investment plans use country data. So for Kenya, for example, we use the 2020 to 2021 data. It doesn't get more recent than that. There's Ghana, there's Nigeria, there's Philippines coming up, there's Barbados that has been started, Sierra Leone. And the purpose of this is actually the countries to position themselves, because we can say we're going to go through this just equitable energy transition, but if internally as a country, we don't know what our roadmap is, then we're leaving ourselves open to be someone else's narrative, someone else's business plan. So the opportunity with the transition plans is that they drill down to adaptation and they're very realistic. Some of the sectors covered are clean cooking. A lot of Africa, their transition will be seen on the clean cooking. If we don't transition clean cooking, then we're not going to meet our global climate goals. The second part is there's a population increase. Those numbers are in our countries, and we can project them. So if we say there's going to be 90 million people living in a country by 2050, what are we doing about that? So it brings in the nexus between energy, climate, and development. And when you have that, and you know you're going to develop, and we know our countries are talking about industrializing and becoming the next industrialization zone, we need to have that low carbon development planned from now. Otherwise, once again, we're missing the boat. I'd like to also add in the opportunity around, for example, green low carbon industrialization. We talk about transport. We are a highly importing consumer society in Africa, especially cars. We get secondhand cars from somewhere else. So how do we position ourselves that we have enabling policies? Yes, we are importing at the moment, but then moving forward, is there an opportunity to actually manufacture locally? And not local to the point of just a country, but regional. And now we start looking at Africa as a region that actually can support Africa trade. The other aspect as well is buildings. Where do all the materials come from? Do we have to import 80% of the construction materials from somewhere else? So with the just energy transition, when we're looking at that, it's also looking at the opportunities to shift from being consumer societies, start doing local manufacturing, not just providing jobs, but supporting entrepreneurs. Because I haven't seen someone who's employed who's ever become very wealthy, but I've seen people who've innovated, who are entrepreneurs, become wealthy, and on that aspect. I wanted to also talk about the energy demand, and Dr. Augustine put it quite well, that a lot of the private companies, they don't know where to plug in with all these different documents and strategies and plans. But the opportunity with an energy transition and investment plan is so granular that it actually shows private sector investment, 70% of the investment needed to actually meet these targets is going to be from the private sector. Then it shows the private sector on exactly what is needed, hence that detail on it. And then talking about working with civil society organizations, we've seen that there's a huge socioeconomic benefit that's missed from all these plans and conversations. So we hear the negative, the sad narrative, but we never hear the positive. And on that basis, there's a great opportunity to also bring the positive so that anything that has been successful can actually be scalable, escalated, and replicated across the countries as well. And I think that's one of the aspects about sustainable energy for all, really drilling down to what the countries are doing, what the countries need, and it's not one plan fits all.
Completely agree.
Add that, yeah.
Yeah, no, I could not agree more. I think this is absolutely the right approach. There's been a lot of Africa-wide plans, a lot of Africa-wide strategies, and it is important to have a union that connects us all. But really, if you really want action, it really happens at the kind of the lowest level, lowest impact. I just want to maybe reflect on one thing you said around clean cooking and transport, and especially for Kenya, it really came to light. Our electricity grid is very green, but our transport, the energy we use for our transport and how we cook, for every 100, EED advisory was saying, for every 100 units of energy used in Kenya, 30 is green electricity, but there's also a significant amount of energy we use in transport and in cooking that is not green, and there's a lot of emissions that come out of that harm Africans. So we need to really think about energy in all its forms when we are discussing mitigation. But with that, maybe I'll pass to, we can start, I don't know if shall we start with you again?
Yeah,
right?
sure. Yeah, that's why I'm here.
Perfect. We'll go across the row. So you can give your closing remarks. Thank you.
My closing remarks is the story around, the last mile having very little energy and not being, conducive to the private sector element is because that last mile doesn't have the productive use of energy. We're just doing the last mile to do one light bulb and one socket. But when we start looking at industrializing and having these opportunities of manufacturing. That
Yes.
last mile will put the transport sector on that last mile,
Yeah.
the buildings in the last mile. So that means our demand will grow, and it will actually be private sector conducive, but also having the civil society right in the center of it. And I like the whole element around human-centric. We keep talking about the fuels, and we forget it's about the people. And we really need to have the people conversation, because at every point of every decision on whichever fuel we use, there's a person at the end of it. And if it's not affordable, then we are repeating the same story again without the transition. Thank
Yeah.
you. I think.
Yeah, demand signal is so key. We really need to consume more power. And I think...
Sorry, may I add?
Sure.
By consuming,
Yeah,
it has to be efficient as well.
efficient, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Double.
And being an energy efficiency specialist, we really need to be efficient with our power. Not efficient because we want to reduce the power, it's because we want more for all these things I've talked about.
Yeah, to go as far as possible, the energy
Yes,
we generate.
thank you.
Absolutely. I just want to maybe just quickly reflect on how essential it is that African people consume as I would say as much green electricity as possible, because that is the key to prosperity. And our friend Todd Moss for Energy for Growth usually says there's a lot of criticism that an American fridge consumes more electricity in a year than an African, but actually it's not that the fridge should consume less, it's that Africans need to consume more energy, green energy, so that we can develop, we can prosper. And it's the fact. I mean, I'm looking at a stat here. There's a coal to steel processing plant in China that has on-site capacity of 5.1 giga, and my entire nation, we're at not even 3 giga. So one factory in China is producing more electricity than my entire country, and that is the issue at play. We need to really stimulate demand, consume more green electricity, and that is the key for industrialization and prosperity. I could go on as you see, but maybe Leonie, I'll pass to you for your closing remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll mainly like to express my appreciation for the initiative to trigger thoughts to address these issues jointly. So meaning content-wise, looking for synergies which exist, as we know and as we were helped to further understand by this panel, but also strategically looking into who and how to work on these synergies jointly. And I think looking a little bit in the future, thinking of green industrialization and the hydrogen sector, for example, one could see, or I would really like to urge to try to bring all the different actors to one table, because I think it's really the key to a successful implementation in this new sector, especially coming up and setting the right basis. And as you mentioned, for example, bringing resources, for example, to civil society is one crucial first step, I would say.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. Rebecca, over to you.
Well, let me start by thanking PACJA for bringing us together for this conversation and sort of tying the linkages between adaptation, energy access, and just transition. Just to try and tie a couple of threads. If I were to answer the question, so now that we've had this conversation, what can we do practically to foster these connections and solidify the connections between these three pillars that we've been talking about for the past hour? I would say three things. One, I would say it's about sort of embedding energy in adaptation and then embedding adaptation in energy plans, right? And we don't need a new platform, we don't need a new initiative to do this, thank goodness, right? We all have enough. We're platformed and initiatives out, right? But we have enough platforms out there. We have the network of national adaptation planning. We have the Africa Adaptation Initiative. We have the AFD adaptation compacts at the national level. And on the energy side, we have more than sufficient energy platforms, right? So thinking about how we embed even in our quantification of what we mean by adaptation targets, which is still an unanswered question, how we embed energy access targets in that, and vice versa, thinking about even as now we're doing energy planning no longer at the national level. At least I can speak for Kenya. We've devolved, and now we're doing, it's county level energy plans that add up to the national energy plan. So we have an opportunity to use tools like the Energy Access Explorer, which World Resources Institute that I work with runs in Africa, to now develop county-level energy access plans that have adaptation targets and locally adaptation principles embedded in those energy plans. So what have we done there? We've created multiple entry points for holding our leaders accountable on adaptation and on energy access, right? And so that's how we make sure that principles of locally led, principles of community owned, principles of community-informed metrics and targets are embedded on both sides. So that's number one. And as I said, we have the networks, the initiatives. This is about ensuring that the embedding is happening on both sides and making explicit what we all know is this sort of implicit connection between the two. The second thing I would say is we need to transform the nature of finance and investment flowing into the continent. That's what Jabri was talking about at the very, very beginning, both for energy access and for adaptation. So on adaptation, this means ensuring it's a complex space. Climate finance is a complex space. Even right now, we're all in our WhatsApps getting the messages. Is it new money? Is it ODA? It's a complex space, right? We don't have to go further than that. So developing locally led curriculum that allows our ministries of finance, our treasuries, our county level treasury offices to have the skills that they need to negotiate and engage in climate finance conversations and attract adaptation finance to every country on this continent. That's a big opportunity for how we link these two. And at WRI, we have RAMP. We're accelerating the access to adaptation finance capacity through developing these local curricula with local universities, in partnership with local universities. It also means influencing the way that investment flows into the continent. Right now, we talked a bit about at the beginning about the fact that very little investment is flowing into the continent for energy access. That's our most financed sector, and we're still getting trickles. And that's our most commercial, most financed, clean technology sector is energy. So if we can't influence the way that finance is flowing into the continent for energy access, what are we going to say for agriculture and restoration and forest protection and urban resilience and all the rest of them, right? So this means having a real conversation about how we actually encourage more equity, more international investment, and more domestic investment into our energy technologies. And again, at WRI, we have a platform that we're launching on Tuesday called the Africa Energy Dialogues that helps us unpack this. And the third thing I would say is, which is what Augustine started with, is changing the argumentation that we use, the very narrative that we use, and making that an evidence-based and Africanized narrative. And if we're successful in all three of those ways, of the embedding in our planning, of transforming the way that we think about finance and engage on finance through our own capacities, and developing our own local narratives, that connection, that trifecta that you've brought us here to talk about will be inevitable. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That is very compelling stuff, and I agree with all your 3 points. Maybe we can go to next panelist, Augustine. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been a very rich discussion, and I just want to conclude by saying that we should always try to address the issue of energy poverty and climate vulnerability together, because they are driven by the same forces, and we cannot, address them separately. And secondly, that energy poverty is a driver of climate vulnerability. So addressing vulnerability must include, must be done through increasing access to energy. We have, you said something about green hydrogen, and speaking as the African civil society, I think we cannot leave this table without talking about it. You pointed out very clearly the drive another concurrence or competition to penetrate Africa for green hydrogen, we should take that with a pinch of salt. In fact, our partners, Germanwatch and ACSEA and PACJA, we came out with a fact sheet, which we can share because we have a soft copy on the fact sheets on green hydrogen. Our conclusion is that green hydrogen, if it is not in the interest of African economy, will not be very helpful. If it's just to, earn hard currency from Europe and solve Europe problems while Africa is in darkness, then it is not worth the salt. We should address these things. And again, finally, we, in ACSEA and PACJA, we're rolling out a program called Building Resilience and Adaptive Capacities to Enhance Energy Access in Africa. We are not looking at energy, green energy or clean energy from a mitigation point of view only. We're also, and most importantly, looking at it from the building resilience and adaptive capacity. So we're inviting all of us sitting here to join that because we'll be having a major conference sometimes next year on building resilience and adaptive capacities to enhance energy access, called BREST Africa Conference. We will be discussing these things. And it adds up to what my sister Elizabeth was saying. If we don't have energy to the communities for productive uses, it will only be seen as one light bulb in the middle of the parlor and one miserable television and a socket to charge bulbs. That is not what energy needs of Africa are. We need energy for cooking, for heating, for preservation, for transport, and every other thing that influences the rural economy. So we should look at energy from that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Augustine, for that. I was just Googling the new energy minimum, which is a recommendation that we need to increase the metric that measures how an individual now has access to energy, and it needs to go up because it can't just be a bulb. It has to be productive use. It has to go beyond that for us to really uplift our communities. And last but not least, Fatimatu, over to you. Thank you.
OK. Comme conclusion, je vais remercier les organisateurs de ce panel qui est PACJA et ACSEA d'avoir fait confiance à la plateforme PACJA Burkina et ACSEA Burkina. Je dirais que les questions des énergies renouvelables, à travers une initiative que nous avons lancée cette année, à tous, de façon platonique, je vais vous expliquer pourquoi. Parce que nous avons bénéficié d'un fonds de PACJA et de ACSEA pour la réalisation d'un projet sur la valorisation des cartons, des déchets de carton en alvéoles d'œufs. Et il faut dire que bien avant, on n'avait que trois volontaires qui travaillaient avec nous et on ne valorisait que 100 kilos par là de façon mensuelle. Et aujourd'hui, avec l'accompagnement de cette initiative-là, nous pourrons aller à une production de plus de 5000 tonnes de carton, de déchets carton, et qui va employer une dizaine de jeunes directs et plus de 30 jeunes, enfin de femmes de jeunes, comme emploi indirect. Alors, il faut dire que ces cartons-là étaient par ailleurs brûlés et qu'ils émettaient du CO2 dans l'espace, ce qui impactait l'environnement, mais également la santé des communautés. Et aujourd'hui, cela serait mis à l'échelle et va créer de l'emploi. Lorsque nous parlons de plus que doubler les questions de finances d'adaptation, cela a tout son sens parce qu'aujourd'hui, si nous voulons parler d'industrialisation de l'Afrique, il faut bien que nous allons au-delà parce que nous étions, de façon manuelle, on était à 100 kilos par mois et aujourd'hui, nous irons à plus de 1000 tonnes par mois. L'écart est carrément énorme et je pense qu'on a besoin de plus de soutien, plus d'accompagnement pour accompagner des initiatives et surtout des institutions aussi fortes comme PACJA et ACSEA pour accompagner la jeunesse africaine dans cette démarche-là. Je vous remercie.
Maxia, thank you for that. I would like to just really appreciate again, I think this is the third time it's mentioned, PACJA for convening us in this critical event. I really, maybe we can have a quick round of applause to Eugene and the team and everyone, PACJA, for convening us. It's really an essential dialogue. And maybe to close this panel, is just to mention recently the Africa team in my institution, we were asked, what can Africa learn from the rest of the world in the race to decarbonization into low carbon growth? And the response from myself and the rest of the people who come from the African continent was, we kind of flipped that. We said the rest of the world can learn from African nations because a lot of African nations are already playing an oversized role in renewables deployment. You can look at hydropower in East Central Africa. You can look at green hydrogen in Namibia. You can look at solar leaders in North Africa. And you can look at geothermal in Kenya. And even the biggest criticism of coal in Africa is still tiny because African coal accounts for just about 2.5% of global coal-to-power capacity and emissions, and almost all of that is one nation at the southernmost tip. And then the rest of the continent is 0.03. So you can just think about the criticism lodged towards the continent versus the factual reality. And just to reiterate, I think everyone here by now knows Africa 3 to 4% of cumulative CO2. But if we dissect that 3 to 4% of cumulative CO2, eliminating North and South Africa, you remain with 48 nations and 1 billion people that are emitting less than 1% of cumulative emissions. So there's a lot of ways we can frame this, and every panelist here has said we need to own the narrative. So I think let's just keep that in mind as we finish the rest of the COP days, including Energy Day, which is the day after tomorrow. And we can go now to the Q&A section of this. But I also want to encourage you can please feel free to approach the panelists after this. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's a roaming mic. Is it there? Yeah, can go to a lot of hands, which is good. We have 30 minutes, so feel free to ask your questions.
Thank you very much. Wow, there's a lot of questions. I got okay, I'll try to be brief. Thank you very much for this. First, I want to extend my appreciation for the fact that there's so many women on that panel. Thank you. It's not the case everywhere. And very brilliant as well. Yeah. I present myself. I'm Mirto Tripathi. I'm the president and board member of Replanet, and I also part of Replanet Africa. And we have a campaign coming up which is called Switch On Africa. So I want to say thank you for your deep understanding of the energy issues and the fact that it is at the core of everything. To me, not only is it at the core of the development of Africa, because everything depends on it. You talked about food security, mechanization, fertilizers, all of that, or you talked about water. That includes desalination, sanitations, all of this. You did talk about construction, manufacturing, getting up the value chain. That is an urban as well, planning and everything. All of this will depend on energy. And the importance of energy is that also provides Africa with a choice to spend that energy as it wants to and not as it is being encouraged or dictated to spend. So those are two aspects very important to me. The reason why I say this and the points of the campaign is to say all energies are not equivalent. And in Kenya, as you know very well, for example, geothermal and hydro are renewable energies that provide a base load and permanent power, which wind and solar are not able to provide. Ghana is a signatory of the Net Zero Nuclear Initiative yesterday morning. Uganda is going nuclear as well. Those are not poor people energies, and Africa deserves to have a robust, strong grid that powers all that you mentioned all the time, 24/7. So I think there's a big question about including nuclear in the conversation about energy access to Africa. Absolutely exiting charcoal, you mentioned that, even if it has to mean subsidize a little bit of gas for the meantime, because it has charcoal as health, sanitary, climate, environmental effects on reforestation that are absolutely detrimental. And finally, a very important focus on grid, because if you produce electricity, it doesn't get to the people and the houses, then there's not much you can do. So that's it for me now. I'm sorry I was a little bit long and tried to be on the point. And I would be very interested in talking about the Africa Energy Dialogue you just mentioned, to be launched Tuesday. I'll be there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can respond to each question and then we can go to the next one. So you can pass the mic to the gentleman while we attempt to answer, I think, the role of nuclear in Africa, which is a very controversial but also a very current issue. I want to open it to anyone in the panel who would want to answer that question.
I can take an attempt. I think with nuclear, this is not a direct answer, it's more of a question. What are we going to do with the nuclear waste? I'd like to know, when we are planning this, energy, fuels, resources, what we're doing with waste. I think the waste conversation on renewable energy is fairly advanced, but it's a valid question of exhaustion of what we already have with renewable sources, and even if we sign up to deals on nuclear, currently, when are they going to come live? There's a lot of valid answers to this very valid question. Exactly. So if we're talking about transition, there's a lot of solutions that we can really tap into now, immediately.
Yep.
For nuclear and other technologies that might come up between now and then as we're innovating, there's a lot of aspects that we really have to consider before we take certain routes.
Yeah.
I'll agree with everything that Liz has said, I think the analytics are quite clear. If we're looking at least cost options for the continent, it's clear that renewables are part of that portfolio, the predominance of that portfolio, if we're able to leverage geographic diversity, therefore to minimize our need for storage. Leveraging geographic diversity means transmission across sovereign lines. We're not there yet, there are, if UNECA or AFREC are in the crowd working on the Africa Single Electricity Market, the Africa Continental Transmission Plan, that is going to allow us to do, if we get to the goals, that will allow us to do trading of power within and between countries in our power pools to allow us to leverage that geographic diversity. If we're not talking about, if we're only talking about generation, to be very honest, actually, a lot of our countries have what we would call a surplus of generation. In Kenya, we have much more generation online than we actually use. We never reach the peak, right? This is the same case for Uganda. A lot of East African countries, because of the hydropower potential here, actually have a surplus. So you scratch your head and say, but Rebecca, you just told me that we have 600 million people without access on the continent. So the word surplus should not be in our vocabulary. And it's because of transmission and distribution and the lack of access to those things. But it's also because we don't yet even have an economic model for delivering what Liz was talking about earlier, last mile services. So how did we jump to talking about more generation before we've answered all of these other challenges? And so my response to that would just be, there are so many things that we need to be doing to build the plumbing for a system that delivers economic and technical services. That means we have much more to be solving for today, much more pressing matters as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I think let's consider our power pools before we start figuring out nuclear. The gentleman to the right, I think you can.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions, but
10
first of all,
minutes.
sorry?
Sorry, we have 10 more minutes, then we can close it.
Okay. So I was saying that I have two questions, but first of all, I would like to thank you very much for this panel. And you know, you were talking about changing the narratives, and I think that this panel is exactly doing that, because when you talk about just transition, usually we think more about mitigation, and in our context in Africa, we know that, you know, for context for African countries that have to develop, there are a lot more in stakes. So for my two questions, one is on the economic side, the other on social. Economic side, you have talked in your opening remarks and in all the other intervention about, you know, the need for finance, right? Access to finance, investment, the role of credit agencies, but also I'd like to talk about the role of multilateral development banks, you know. So I've learned so much about the facts that you have presented, but I'd like to know more about the solutions. How can we influence credit rating agencies? How can we influence multilateral development banks in order to, you know, tackle those challenges and hindrances that block us from having enough capital flowing into the continent? I would like to have your views on that. And secondly, the Sir has talked about the perception that our communities have about renewables, our communities have about electricity production and transmission. We can sit here and during high-level panels talking about how our economic model should be designed, but we need to take them in the journey, right? So how, when thinking about this green wall, transitioning into this green wall where, you know, energy access is a reality, renewables is a reality, how can we take our communities, especially at the last mile in rural areas, in that journey? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll pass to my panelists, but maybe just because yes, but once we go to the questions, we have to keep them really brief because we have five minutes left. I would want to say, since you remarked on opening remarks that I made, for cost of capital reduction, there's a big initiative by the head of state in Barbados, Her Excellency Mia Motley, around the Bridgetown agenda and her mechanism and concept of foreign exchange partial guarantee mechanism, which is really fascinating, and talks about how to reduce cost of capital, not just in Africa, all over Global South. I just wanted to reference that. But in credit rating agencies, I think a lot of Africans are not convinced that a for-profit company should be rating sovereign nations in Africa when they don't even have an actual presence in African countries. They don't exist in African countries. And UNECA has called on African nations' treasuries and regulators to challenge these companies because there's no avenues for recourse. Yeah. So I just wanted to make that, but please, anyone else in the panel wants to answer that, then we'll just take 3 more questions, please.
I'll just add to your question was specifically about MDBs. And interestingly, if you look at an average of MDBs, multilateral development banks, across the globe, for every dollar that they invest, they catalyze 14 cents of private sector investment. 14 cents is literally pennies, right? When they're supposed to be catalyzing multiples of what they put in, they're supposed to be catalyzing multiples, and the average is 14 cents. So our MDBs need to do a lot more to play a catalytic role. And I think that if anyone from AfDB is in the audience, they can talk about how they're sort of changing might not be the right word, but enhancing mechanisms that already exist, not just in energy, but across the board for agriculture, adaptation, as mentioning, and so on, to really play more of that catalytic role. What our energy need in Africa is 27 billion per year up to 2030 to deliver universal energy access. We won't get there with AfDB or MDBs alone. It has to be catalytic, and 14 cents on the dollar will not do it.
Completely agree. Yeah, I agree. When they talk a big game about millions translating into billions of private sector, it never materializes. So maybe we'll take the lady. I do apologize. I don't think we'll come to you. You can approach the panelists, but we'll do 1, 2, 3, then we'll close.
Ok, merci pour la parole. Je vais aller en français. Je sais que pour vous c'est compliqué, mais peut-être avec l'aide de Monsieur Eugène, on pourra avoir une traduction. Donc, je voulais saluer le thème de ce panel, vraiment, et confirmer que l'accès à l'énergie pour l'Afrique est plus qu'une nécessité actuellement. Parce que tous ceux qui sont en train de lutter pour soulager un peu le poids des changements climatiques sur les femmes en Afrique, cela se fait, selon moi, à travers l'accès à l'énergie. Aujourd'hui, je viens d'un pays où l'accès à l'énergie, je viens du Burkina Faso, où l'accès à l'énergie n'est plus une question de droit. C'est plus un droit pour eux, mais c'est un luxe. La majeure partie de ceux qui sont dans mon pays. Mais ce n'est pas normal parce qu'on sait que sans énergie, on ne peut rien faire. Au Burkina Faso, la majeure partie de l'énergie qu'on a se base sur le bois énergie. Les communautés utilisent le bois énergie, énergie comme principale source d'énergie. Aujourd'hui, avec les changements climatiques et tout ce qu'on a eu, ce qu'on voit, c'est une ressource qui est très rare. Donc le poids de cette rareté repose sur les femmes et les filles. Une femme, tes ressources n'augmentent pas, alors que pour trouver même du bois sur le marché, quelque chose qui n'est pas conseillé, c'est vraiment rare. Donc c'est une charge énorme pour ces femmes-là. Donc aujourd'hui, j'aimerais porter la voix des femmes du Burkina Faso qui souffrent pour avoir l'accès même à l'énergie de cuisson, pour la nourriture, même pour leur famille. N'en parlons pas de profiter des opportunités que l'accès à l'énergie nous donne. Sans énergie, vous êtes d'accord que cela même joue sur la connaissance, l'éducation. Aujourd'hui, l'un des impacts du changement climatique dans mon pays, c'est la hausse des températures. Il fait excessivement chaud et les enfants partent à l'école, prennent des cours dans des classes où il fait vraiment chaud. Donc j'aimerais vraiment lancer un appel pour qu'au niveau de l'Afrique, on accélère l'agenda pour l'accès à l'énergie et pour la cuisine et pour le développement. Merci.
Just come.
Yes.
Okay.
So very briefly, she just points out that, reiterating some of the things that have been said, that the priority for the continent is energy access, but also that it's a problem that primarily affects women, and is giving an elaborate example of the situation in Burkina Faso, where women who rely essentially on fuel wood are exposed to all of the health and social hazards related to that. And she thinks that the voices of these women need to be echoed in these conversations. So it's more of a comment than a question.
Okay. Then maybe to the lady, you want to ask your question?
Yeah.
And then I do apologize, we are completely out of time. We only have 2 questions, I apologize. Yeah, the question, keep it brief, please, and then very brief. Yeah.
Okay, thanks to the panel for this insightful discussion. I would like to say, when we talk about adaptation or just transition, we cannot forget the crucial role of technology and infrastructure. So as African countries facing those challenges, how can we do to ensure effectively just transition and adaptation in Africa? Thank you.
Good question. And maybe we can have your last question, then we'll answer both of them, and then Eugene will close.
Yes, mine is very simple. I'll keep it brief. One of the panelists taught us that Africa, about 70%, have electricity of less than 5 hours. I will not mention their names, but I want them to smile deep down in their hearts. Then another member of the audience taught us that about less than 4% of renewable energy funds reach Africa. So how do we address this gap? Or is Africa meant to, in Mr. Gaston's words, keep romanticize about energy access? Thank you.
Good questions, thank you. I'm sorry, we've closed the Q&A session for this. We are completely out of time. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Ok. Je vais pour répondre la réponse du monsieur dont sa question portait sur la contribution. Comment est-ce que nous travaillons à faire contribuer la communauté locale dans nos initiatives vertes? Déjà, il faut dire que les questions de l'alphabétisation pour l'Afrique, c'est déjà un défi. Mais un défi qui ne devrait pas nous effrayer, s'il faut le dire, parce qu'aujourd'hui, au sein de notre organisation, sur les sites où nous travaillons, nous comptons 80% de nos volontaires ou même de nos employés qui sont analphabètes. Enfin, c'est le défi que je me suis fait. 80% qui sont analphabètes. Et notre superviseuse, c'est une dame. Elle est handicap et elle est analphabète. Et aujourd'hui, cela n'est pas un frein pour nous parce que nous avons pris l'habitude de déterminer nos mots techniques et enfin sur les activités que nous menons. Et si nous rentrons prochainement après la COP, nous avons à former 200 femmes dans la communauté locale dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre d'un projet de Christian Aid sur la formation des femmes sur les questions du charbon bio. Donc, 200 femmes locales à les former sur les questions du charbon bio, mais en langue locale. Donc, limite, moi, je pense que la communauté locale, nous-mêmes, en tant que porteurs de projets dans nos différents pays, doivent même être porteurs de solutions auprès de ces communautés-là pour les impliquer davantage, mais aussi faire appel à la communauté locale de réaliser, ou même de nos gouvernements, de réaliser des documents pour décrire nos termes techniques, climatiques, afin de faciliter, nous qui sommes sur le terrain là, de mieux faire passer l'information à ces communautés.
Okay,
Merci.
thank you. I think we will have to close it. We have 6 minutes left. If we can give a quick round of applause to my panelists, I think they've done a really good job. Thank you so much. And I want to welcome Eugene to the lectern to close for us. And then Eugene, maybe I can selfishly ask, once you've closed, if we can take a family photo after closing. Thank you.
So thank you so much. If you remembered at the beginning, we flipped our program on its head. And so I'm going to get back to a bit that we left at the beginning. That's why I needed those 6 minutes. I'd like to invite Dr. Mitika Mwenda, the Executive Director of PACJA, to say a few final words. He should have welcomed us, but I think at this point, it will be more of an appreciation. Is Dr. Mwenda in the room?
Is he listening?
I saw him.
Thank you, Eugene. I was not intending, actually, that's why I was hiding at the corner. So, thank you, the panelists, and all for this, your contribution. This is a very important subject for us. We need to interface. We need to connect the dots. The issue of energy is very critical. In every events which we have been having, just the previous two, today on loss and damage, on scaling up finance, the, climate and health. All these are sectoral issues which are intertwined. The question is, where are we going to start and where are we going to end? Because issues are so much, and we need particularly resources for this. And so, working in silos is no longer an option. Whether you are a single organization, whether you are a network, whether you are working in a particular sector, we need to find a way of working together. I think that is the message which we have. And for PACJA, for ACSEA, for our networks which we work with, our priority is really how we can build bridges, including even with the governments, including even with the governments in both north and south. We need really to create that north-south movement because our people need to talk. We need to speak to each other. And so, as we meet here, this COP is a very fertile ground for extending these outreaches. Let us see how we can have relationships like this panel, which we have. Very diverse, both north and south. And if we can be able even to extend that to governments, well and good. So thank you very much. I don't want to repeat the technical issues which have been tackled by experts who are sitting there. I think for me, it's just to reiterate our commitment. As we push governments, from the north particularly, to honor and keep their promises, we need also to look back and see what our government's doing, what is their role, particularly in this global stocktake process. We are almost half of the to the end of this COP. Are we making any gains? Any progress in terms of resources? Any progress in terms of promises on emission reductions? Because that is what we are talking about in terms of energy transition. What powers that is what this panel has been discussing. Are we making progress? I don't want to say that we are yet to celebrate, and you know where we are, in the quarters of fossil fuels. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Dr. Mwenda. I really want to thank the panel. I know there were difficulties finding your way here, but I'm glad that we finally made it. When we designed this, we had a number of objectives, and I think we've got quite close to those objectives, and I'm so happy that we had this conversation. It's only a beginning, and next year we want to deepen these reflections and move from talking about these things to see how we made some of these things more concrete. So thank you so much for coming. I want to apologize to those who wanted to speak but couldn't. The time frame is they're very strict with their time, so we needed to be right on point. It's more of a broadcast arrangement. So see you next time, and we stay in touch.